All right, so today we're going to talk about Sargent's storytelling because he's the examples for why details will ruin your art and why in masterworks of art details are often not seen. So, I'm going to composite this video into three parts. I'll show you some of Sargent's art and we'll talk about why good art doesn't have detail. And at the end, I'll give you some actionable advice onto how to actually make this a reality in your own paintings and drawings. So let's get right into it. When we talk about art, good art, bad art, masters, how they got to where they are, and why beginners start where they are, we have to understand what art actually is as a concept, as a phenomena. And it gets very abstract extremely quickly, but we're going to navigate it with simplicity and we're going to go fast. It's going to make sense. So, does not make a lot of sense. If we're in a museum and you look at other people and they're blue in the face just staring at a painting and they get goosebumps from it or it moves them, it's absurd on the surface if you think about it. It's just dead plants, linen or cotton or whatever, and it just has a bunch of tiles of chroma and oil and all this crap pasted on top of it just by some guy who made it 500 years ago or whatever. And people just stare at it in awe. For music, it makes even less sense. People are just uttering these random frequencies into, your car stereo or your ears or whatever, with these wooden instruments that make these different vibrations, and it can make people cry. It can make people realize things about life or what have you. And it makes no sense, right? But at least compared to other sort of things. So biology has a very obvious explanation. We've seen how science has transformed our lives. It's very obvious why history is important, let's say, as a subject. But for art, it doesn't make as much sense. So this is all relevant to how you get better at art, because to get better at something, you kind of have to understand what it actually is. So if you look at art, I'm going to make a statement here, and this might offend some people, but I'm still going to do it. The general consensus among master artists is that art is communication. So Steve Houston, Marco Bucci, just to name two, they believe solely that art is communication in its essence. And that makes the most sense, and I'm going to go on to explain why. Because if we look at the metric of good versus bad art and the emotional resonance that you get from it, it always revolves around how well the person communicated a point. So when we're going into the mystery of good versus bad art, good art communicates well and bad art communicates poorly, right? And you'll see this trend over and over and over again, especially as you make more and more paintings and drawings and stuff. Your best paintings communicated well, your worst paintings did not communicate well. But here I'm going to try to bring you up to speed with what takes years often to understand. And that's that details are often very flashy and they take the forefront of a lot of people's mind, but a lot of the time it actually makes the art worse. So to explain this, we have to look at the lyrics of a famous song, actually. And this will illustrate the point more literally, because when we're dealing with visual arts, arguments are very hard to see, not pun intended, right? But it's a lot easier to think about within music because it's through words. And I think words communicate the point more effectively to your logic conscious brain. So if we read the lyrics of Captain Jack by Billy Joel, it says, "So you decide to take a holiday. You got your tape deck and your brand new Chevrolet. Ah, there ain't no place to go anyway. What for? So you got everything, but nothing's cool. They just found your father in a swimming pool, and you guess you won't be going back to school anymore." So you can see that this communicates like a dream. You know, in dreams where you're bouncing around all over the place, you're, in Denver one day, and then you're in a Kmart or a Wawa's, or you're in Japan or something. Dreams teleport you around a lot. And music teleports you around a lot too. And visual art does it as well. And the way that it does that is by omitting unnecessary details, because the point is more important than the specifics of the surrounding context. And when you understand that, you can really start to go very far. But you can see clearly in lyricism that good poetry leaves a lot up to the imagination, but it has one cohesive point. Captain Jack, for example, is about how when you're nihilistic and you have almost no point to your life, you go away to drugs or other sort of things to have an escape. And that's the general point, and you can see that all the lyrics kind of relate to it. having a terrible life is related to the guy who's dead in the swimming pool and he's not going back to school. Everything's changing for him. And then it goes into the chorus, which talks about things that aren't going to monetize me on YouTube. But let's imagine that the artist had said this instead. So let's imagine Billy Joel, brilliant lyricist, had said, "You're traveling to the south side of the city in New York in your Uber, where the driver is driving a Honda Accord, and he talks to you about his wife's bitter resentment towards her coworker Sheila. This south side is 3 miles away from your apartment, which is located somewhere in the Pacific Ocean." I'm sure you get the point. That was probably boring and excruciating to actually listen to. And that's not because it didn't rhyme. That's because it had no point at all, right? And it was overly detailed, and that's the massive thing. So when we're talking about the three things that are the most critical to arts communication, it's simplicity, purpose, and a lack of distraction. And you can see that details often, the problem is that they distract from the subject. And you see this time and time and again. And I'm going to show you a visual arts example finally through this hyper-realistic art. And you can see that it's technically impressive. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Obviously, you know that this is this old man or whatever. But it comes off as a little bit emotionally constipated. I don't know about you, but when I look at it, I'm not captured and invigorated by like the favorite paintings or my favorite songs. And I've come to the conclusion that it's because of the details. It's too detailed. And the surrounding sort of information doesn't really supplement the point very well. And you're going to see through these Sargent examples that I show next, that same theme really occurring a lot. And talking about Sargent, because that's what this video is mostly about, and how he actually implemented narrative, which is what communication actually is that you're communicating a story, which is what Sargent did so effectively. Same with dreams, and same with lyrics and music. So I'm hoping you're seeing the patterns now. But Careless Duran, which was Sargent's teacher at the Atelier, he said, "In art, all that is not indispensable is unnecessary." And although that sounds kind of redundant and maybe stupid, if you think about it and its redundancy, it's actually not. It's really profound. And you'll see that in music, in visual art, in whatever, that rings true through everything. And that's because in communication, people want it quick and simple. And emotions really, really are flamed up by stuff that's as simple as it can be, but no simpler than that. And when you can do that, you're an effective speaker, you're an effective artist. That's what an artist is an effective communicator, and usually to the emotions. And emotions are evoked by that synthesis of information and that clear communication. So we're going to take all that theory and all that abstraction and all that head up in the cloud stuff, and we're going to actually bring it down to the earth, into the ground, hopefully with these examples with Sargent. So if we look at Venetian Interior in 1882, you can see that this image has a subject. It has an obvious point. And just like how every song has a chorus, every essay has a thesis, every painting has a subject. And that's because we like knowing what the point is really quickly. That's the way the subconscious brain likes to work. And when you have an obvious subject in your painting, people emotionally resonate with it more. And when you have a subject, the only way you can make it the subject of the painting is by subduing interest in other areas. So you make all the colors less saturated in the exterior of the subject. You also make all the edges softer in the peripheral. You make the values darker usually because your eye is captured by light. All these sort of things, and you use these techniques to actually make it have a very obvious subject. And one of the worst ways to ruin the subject of a painting, which ruins the communication, which ruins the artwork in general, is by putting too much detail in the peripheral elements. So, because details capture the eye like that, they're just too loud on a painting, if you excuse the metaphor here. And if you look into the background of this painting, Sargent didn't indicate almost anything, but he indicated enough of what he had to say. And you can see that in the background here, for example, the person by the actual window, everything is suggested. And the idea of suggestion you're going to see very, very often in lyricism and painting and whatever. It's all over the place. And when you can suggest that something is there without directly stating it, and then you can really put detail into the subject matter, the actual important part of the image, people are going to really resonate with your art a lot more. And these are the kind of unconscious things that separate amateurs from people who are masters. And it's not necessarily intellectually understanding all this logically and so that you can articulate it. It's more understanding it through your hands and through the way that you process your art. But obviously, it usually goes unconsciously, and then you can unconsciously do it. So we're also going to look at some other examples in different mediums to show you that it's not just specifically towards Sargent's oil paintings. But let's look at this watercolor by Sargent, Girl with Umbrella, in 1900. So this one is cool because Sargent really liked watercolors. He didn't actually like doing a lot of the portrait paintings and the oil paintings because although it got his career started off, especially in France and other areas, he was an international man, but he didn't like doing portraits for his sitters because most of them were kind of pompous and annoying. They were very new money and probably full of themselves, and portraiture is a place of vanity, if we're being honest, because the whole thing is about them. So the people who wanted the portraits were probably very vain, but he went to watercolors, is my point, around this time. A little bit later is when he actually stopped doing oil portraits. I think his last was in 1908, something like that, but somebody can comment below and correct me. But anyway, so in this watercolor, we can see that the peripheral elements of the watercolor are just nothingness. They're abstraction. They could not stand alone as a painting. And that's because they all supplement the subject by looking unimportant. And you can see that in the subject, all the sharpest edges, all the darkest values, excluding the exterior, but you don't really look at the edges in the background because he uses the compositional tool of centering. But anyway, generally speaking, the darkest values, the sharpest edges, the most detail is really important here, are put into the subject. And when I'm talking about detail, I don't mean to never use detail ever. It's to use it sparingly so that it has the visual punch. Because when you have too much of something, even your favorite thing, you kind of dislike it, you know? So I'm sure we've all noticed this, we get obsessed with certain things, you know, a certain ice cream, let's say a certain food, a certain song, whatever. If we listen to it too much and it's too much abundance in our outer environment, we don't like it as much. And it's the same for what you're proportionally doing within an image. If there's too many reds, we don't like the color red as much. If there's too many sharp lines, they each speak less, right? And the same with words. If I'm saying a lot of words, every extra word that I add on makes the last word less meaningful just by the amount that you're using. So if we look at this painting, if everything was sharp and everything was detailed, then the details wouldn't mean anything and you wouldn't be attracted to that face magnetically like you are in this one. And he did it through this, again, the suggestion, and it came off beautifully here. So the next one is another oil painting because he was known for his oil paintings, but it wasn't a normal portrait, but this one has a really strong subject as well. It was called The Fountain, Villa Tortellina, Frascati, Italy, in 1907, and it was also oil on canvas. But you can see on this one of my favorites actually, has an obvious subject, has really good use of contrast. If you squint your eyes, she is just a white blob right there in the middle of the canvas, and that makes her so obviously important. And there's the obvious subject for you, right? Everything else around her supplements the image. It tells you contextually where they are, kind of like how a book in the beginning, you know, setting, context, whatever, that's what it does. The background is supposed to do that, but it's not supposed to distract from the main point of the narrative here. So Sargent's telling a story to us, and he's saying to us through values, through lines, through edges, that this woman right in the middle is the most important part of the image. And this guy next to her supplements it. And the painting that she's doing supplements that. So it shows that she's painting. And then we know that it's outside. And all these things kind of string together in one kind of flick when we look at the painting. And our subconscious just sucks it up. And then it understands what it's about because it's actually curated for us to emotionally understand it. So I'm going to finally give you some practical tips, some actual tips, because I know a lot of that was probably abstract, and some people like the abstraction stuff, but other people don't. So tips on how to actually achieve the effect. Back up from your canvas. This is a really important one. You cannot stay close to your canvas just right next to it. That does not work. So Sargent was known for going back and to and fro from his canvas, and I'm sure if you watch me, you've heard me say that 1,000 times, but that's because it's so critical. And he wanted to see the big picture. And the big picture is where the big mistakes lie. And big mistakes, just like details, distract from the subject. if you have a face and that's where you want the viewer to look, but you have this mangled, dangling hand that looks god awful, your eye is going to go right to the hand because it distracts from the subject. You never want to distract the eye from the subject unless it contextualizes the painting. And I'm sure you saw that through a lot of Sargent's work, and you'll start to see it through music and other things. But the next thing is go general to specific. And this is similar to the backup from your canvas idea, but when you're blocking in the main shapes, you don't want to get too detailed too fast, because you might end up putting detail somewhere that is unnecessary. Since things are so relative when you're dealing with painting, everything is next to one another and everything speaks and interacts and has this continuity between it and this cohesion. And when you have something like that, even if you have a mangled hand like we were talking about before, if it's placed in such a way in a certain area, it might not even bother the viewer at all, because they might not even notice it. And if you overwork it and make it perfect or whatever, then it might cause a problem. So go general to specific, work on several areas at a time, and always tell yourself, well, I'm going to go back to that area. And you might not necessarily have to go back to it, because what will happen is that you work on all the areas and you say, I'm not done with this painting necessarily, but I'll come back the next day. And then when you come back, you might not even notice that there's something wrong with it. And if you don't notice that there's something wrong with it and other people don't, then you got away with it. Just like that new art guy, very famous, I forgot his name, but he said, art is what you can get away with. And that's kind of true. So think about that. Anyway, so the next one is use a mirror. So this is going to really help you as well. If you think that something looks wrong or it's not detailed enough or whatever, and you flip it around, and I mean, you can literally hold your painting up to a mirror, you can take a picture of it, and you can push the little inverse button. It's on Apple, on their iPhotos, but I'm not sure if it's on Samsung. But anyway, find a way to flip your photo around, or your painting around, and you can see if the problem is actually an issue or if you're just overthinking it because you're looking at it too much. And that'll really help you. So flip it around. Don't flip it around too much, because then you'll become desensitized to the actual flipped around version. But that's practical to use. A lot of artists use that. I remember even Philip Laszlo, there's a video of him using a tiny little mirror when he was making a painting. So that's interesting. And he was a famous painter 100 years ago. So, the masters have been using that forever. So I now give that to you. But very useful trick. So the next thing is leave your work for a while. So Abbott Thayer, who's a famous painter, he said that he would ruin his painting if he worked on it for more than 3 days. And although his work is very loose, it's very effective. And it might be 4 days for you, it might be 2 days for you or whatever, but you need to find out a certain time where you're going to be overworking it. And if you're working it for 3 days and you still don't think it's done, you might want to leave it for about a month or two, which is what he would usually do, and then come back to it. And then you have that fresh eye and that objectivity that you lose when you look at a painting for too long and you make it over detailed. And then you're going to actually see what's essential to the main point of the image, because if you put something in there that looks non-essential, it's going to look ugly, right? And beauty is clarity and being specific towards a purpose. So make sure you do that. And the next thing is make sure you're getting ample feedback from coworkers, your sister, your wife, whatever, your girlfriend, doesn't matter. You need to get feedback consistently. Is this painting better than that painting? Do you notice anything wrong with this painting, for example? Ask those kind of questions. And people are happy to help you, because they love when people love when you ask them for their opinion. So they'll happily help you. But it's important to get that kind of feedback. And if you don't have anybody specifically who you can trust because they always butter you up or, sugarcoat things and they're too bubbly or something, then you can go to r/Oilpainting and they'll give you the hard truth. And you can even use the Flair brutal critique or something like that. That's what I always do. And you get really interesting feedback, things you never thought about before, and way more people can see your work other than your family. Hundreds and thousands, even more than that, can see your work and actually comment on it. So that's always very useful if you're trying to see if something's wrong or not, or if you're added too much detail, etc. Because people say, I just don't like it that much. Or if it bombs as far as the upvotes go, you probably did something wrong. It's usually related to over detailing certain areas. So the last thing to leave you with is when you put your finger in a baby's palm and it grips your finger, that's a very instinctual kind of thing. And instinct's weird because it shows up and it just takes over us. And the same thing happens when we're painting. When we're painting, we want to make everything perfect. And I understand this. I'll show some drawings that I used to do. I used to be very, very detailed. And the problem is the thing that I've already outlined. And the only way to get around it is to just resist that instinctual urge to just over detail everything. Know that it'll look good, in that a lot of master painters, when you go close up on their work, it doesn't look right necessarily. So get the idea out of your head that everything has to be perfect. Resist the urge to just blend everything together or overwork certain areas, and you'll be golden. So it's a topic that's very close to me. I find it very interesting. I hope it helped you guys as well. And I hope you guys have a great day. So all the best. Go make something beautiful, and I'll see you later.